At 3:30 p.m. on June 22, 1945, in a command post buried deep beneath the rocky hills of southern Okinawa, General Mitsuru Ushijima picked up the field telephone. The line connected him to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, over 900 miles away. On the other end was General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff. Ushijima's voice was calm, professional, but carried the weight of inevitable defeat. "The situation has become untenable," he said. "Our forces are nearly exhausted. The Americans have broken through all our defensive positions. I recommend preparation for the final phase." Umezu's response crackled through the static. "The Emperor expects you to hold Okinawa at all costs. The very existence of the Empire depends on your resistance." Ushijima paused. He was 58 years old, a career soldier who had served Japan for over 3 decades. He had commanded troops in China, in Manchuria, and now faced the greatest crisis of his military career. Around him, his staff waited in the dim light of the underground bunker, their faces showing the strain of 82 days of continuous combat. "The Americans have captured Shuri Castle," Ushijima continued. "Our supply lines are cut, many of our units have been destroyed. The civilians, many have chosen to..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "The Emperor's will is absolute," Umezu replied. "You will find a way." The line went silent. Ushijima set down the phone and looked at his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho. Both men understood what was coming. In the Japanese military tradition, surrender was unthinkable. Death was preferable to dishonor. Within hours, both men would be dead by their own hands in a ritual that had become all too common in the final days of the Pacific War. Their suicide would mark the end of organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa and the end of their country's dreams of empire. What happened in those 82 days between April 1st and June 22nd, 1945 reveals something profound about the nature of total war and the price of absolute resistance. It shows what happens when nations fight not for victory, but for the manner of their defeat. And it demonstrates a truth that applies far beyond warfare. Sometimes the most courageous thing a leader can do is know when to stop. To understand why Ushijima said what he said and why he chose death over surrender, you have to understand what he had been watching since the spring of 1945 and what kind of man he was. The Battle of Okinawa was not just another island campaign in the endless chain of Pacific battles that had characterized World War II. It was the final step before something far more ambitious and terrifying: the invasion of mainland Japan itself. Codenamed Operation Downfall, this planned assault would dwarf every previous amphibious operation in human history. Since December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft had shattered the peace of Pearl Harbor, American forces had swept across the Pacific with relentless determination. Islands fell like dominoes: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima. Each victory came at a cost, each yard was written with blood and sacrifice. But still, the Japanese held on to their own lives.
I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement.
While Japanese shipyards struggled to replace their losses, American factories churned out aircraft carriers, battleships, and the men to man them. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, had famously declared that the U.S. Navy would build ships faster than Japan could sink them. By 1945, this promise was being fulfilled with terrifying efficiency. To the Americans, Okinawa represented the perfect staging ground for the invasion. Located just 400 miles from the Japanese mainland, the island possessed extensive flatland
I want you to feel free from the chains that last, and to believe in what you got, it was built to last. Yeah.
More importantly, capturing Okinawa would cut Japan off from its remaining sources of raw materials in Southeast Asia and China. The Americans assembled a truly massive force. Admiral Raymond Spoon commanded the most powerful naval force ever assembled.
No, I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough
On land, 3-star General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. commanded the 10th Army, consisting of 180,000 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines. More troops than had landed on D-Day in Normandy. Facing this juggernaut, Japan had committed the 32nd Army under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. And the 32nd Army included some of Japan's finest veteran troops, transferred from Manchuria in late 1944. But numbers were not in Japan's favor. Ushijima commanded roughly 80,000 combat troops, supported by 40,000 additional personnel and civilians who had been pressed into service. What the Japanese lacked in numbers, they attempted to make up for in preparation. Under the direction of Colonel Yahara, a brilliant defensive strategist, the island had been transformed into a fortress. Trenches, bunkers, underground command posts, on the island, the landscape. The entire civilian population, including women and children, had been conscripted into the construction process. Cave systems connected defensive positions across the island, allowing Japanese forces to move freely while remaining protected from American firepower. But perhaps the most desperate element of Japanese strategy was the kamikaze campaign. Japan's industrial capacity had been so damaged by American bombing that they could no longer build enough aircraft or train enough pilots for conventional air warfare. Instead, they would turn young men into human weapons, teaching them to crash their aircraft into American ships. The kamikaze, or a divine wind, represented both Japanese desperation and their belief that spiritual power could overcome material disadvantage. Most dramatically, Japan had committed their final naval reserve to Okinawa's defense. The battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, would lead a one-way mission to the island. Loaded with only enough fuel for a one-way trip, Yamato would beach herself on Okinawa's shores and use her massive guns to support the defenders until she was destroyed. The Japanese strategy also included the total mobilization of the civilian population. Every man, woman, and child on Okinawa was considered a potential soldier. Children were trained to use bamboo spears, women were given suicide grenades, and all civilians were told that capture by Americans would be worse than death. The concept of shame, of bringing dishonor to family and community by surrendering, was exploited systematically to drive civilians toward mass suicide rather than capture. The Americans had chosen their landing beaches with the preliminary bombardment had begun hours before the first wave of landing craft hit the beaches. For 3 days, American battleships, cruisers, and aircraft had pounded the island. Over 40,000 shells, 30,000 rockets, and countless tons of bombs had been dropped on what intelligence believed to be the main Japanese defensive positions. At 8:30 a.m., the first wave of landing craft began their run to the beaches. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Hundreds of amphibious tractors, landing craft, and boats carrying thousands of men toward a hostile shore that had been prepared for their arrival. The men in those landing craft represented the cream of American military power. Marines from the 2nd Marine Division and Army troops from the 7th, 27th, 81st, and 96th Infantry Divisions were about to test their training against the reality of combat. Many had fought on other Pacific islands. Others were veterans of Europe, now fighting their first Pacific battle. But something unexpected happened. As the first wave of soldiers and Marines hit the beaches, they encountered silence. No machine gun fire, no artillery, no resistance of any kind. The beaches that intelligence had predicted would be defended by fanatical Japanese troops were empty. The soldiers who had expected to leap from their landing craft under fire instead found themselves walking calmly ashore. Some actually stood up in their boats to better see what was happening. Marines and infantrymen began joking about what they assumed was the ease of the landing. By noon, entire divisions had landed and were moving inland. The 1st Marine Division had secured the northern approaches without firing a shot. The Army units had established beachheads and were beginning to push toward the interior. By evening, the Americans had secured a beachhead 14 miles wide and 5 miles deep, a success that had taken weeks to achieve on other Pacific islands. Even more surprisingly, the Americans captured the Kadena and Uhara airfields with minimal resistance. These airfields would prove crucial for supporting the invasion and providing bases for aircraft attacking the Japanese home islands. The casualty figures reflected the ease of the initial landing. While 28 Americans had been killed and another 104 wounded, this was incredibly light for an amphibious assault of this magnitude. In comparison, the D-Day landings in Normandy had suffered over 10,000 casualties on the first day. General Buckner, watching the success of the landing from his command ship, was both pleased and suspicious. An easy landing was not necessarily a good sign. It could mean that the Japanese had a different plan than anticipated. Buckner began to prepare his forces for the real battle that he knew was coming. But the absence of Japanese defenders was not due to American naval gunfire or bombardment. It was a deliberate tactical decision. General Ushijima had ordered his troops to withdraw inland, away from the beaches, where they could better utilize their defensive positions and avoid the devastating naval gunfire that had destroyed the defenders on other Pacific islands. The Japanese had spent months preparing a defensive position that stretched from the northern tip of the island to the southern mountains. The Shuri Line, as it was known, was a series of mutually supporting positions built around natural terrain features and connected by extensive tunnel systems. It was designed to trade space for time and maximize American casualties. The initial American strategy had called for a three-pronged advance. The 1st Marine Division would secure the northern part of the island, while the Army units would push south along both coasts. The central mountains would be bypassed and isolated. It was a sound plan based on standard Pacific warfare tactics. But Okinawa's terrain was different from other Pacific islands. The island was mountainous, covered in dense vegetation, and had a road network that was more extensive than expected. These factors would make the American advance slower and more costly than anticipated. By the end of the first day, American reconnaissance patrols had begun to encounter Japanese outposts. The enemy was there, but in small numbers designed to delay and report rather than to fight. The real battle was about to begin. The easy landing had been a gift, but it came with strings attached. The Japanese were giving the Americans room to land their massive army, but they were also concentrating their forces for maximum impact. The price of this apparent kindness would be paid in blood over the coming weeks. While the Americans were establishing their beachheads on Okinawa, the Japanese were launching the largest campaign in history. Codenamed Operation Shikusui, or a Divine Wind, this series of attacks would prove to be the costliest air campaign in United States Navy history. The kamikaze pilots were the face of Japan's desperate strategy. These young men, many barely out of their teens, had volunteered or been conscripted to crash their aircraft into American ships. They carried no survival gear, expected no rescue, and knew they would not return. They were the product of a society that had elevated self-sacrifice to the highest virtue. The aircraft used for kamikaze attacks were a mix of whatever Japan could scrape together. Former fighter planes like the Mitsubishi A6M0, obsolescent trainers, and even civilian aircraft were modified to carry larger bomb loads. What they lacked in sophistication, they made up for in determination and numbers. The first major kamikaze attacks came on April 6th, just 5 days after the initial landing. The USS Enterprise, one of the most famous carriers in the Pacific Fleet, was struck by a kamikaze aircraft that killed 4 crewmen and wounded 50 more. This was just the beginning of a campaign that would see dozens of American ships damaged or destroyed. But the USS Franklin would suffer the most severe damage of any American warship during the Okinawa campaign. On March 19th, just before the main invasion, 2 Japanese aircraft had somehow slipped through American defenses and crashed into the Franklin's flight deck. The resulting explosion and fire killed 724 sailors and wounded 606 more. The Franklin was knocked out of the war for the rest of the campaign. The destroyer USS Aaron Ward was just one of dozens of smaller ships that fell victim to kamikaze attacks. On April 13th, 3 successive kamikaze attacks left the Aaron Ward dead in the water with 27 crewmen dead and 38 wounded. The captain and executive officer were among the casualties. The rescue operations after kamikaze attacks were often as dangerous as the attacks themselves. Sailors would leap into burning oil-covered waters to rescue their shipmates, often suffering severe burns and oil inhalation. themselves. The destroyer USS Laffey, after being hit by 4 kamikaze attacks, had to be abandoned as a total loss. Admiral Spruance, commanding the naval forces, was forced to adapt his tactics to deal with the kamikaze threat. He increased fighter patrols, reorganized his anti-aircraft screen, and sometimes moved his ships further offshore to reduce the effectiveness of suicide attacks. But the Americans were fighting a new kind of war for which their traditional naval tactics were not fully adapted. Kamikaze attacks were not limited to aircraft. The Japanese also employed suicide boats called ashini, which were loaded with explosives and steered by volunteers who would crash them into American ships. These small, fast boats were difficult to detect and even harder to stop. The architect of the Shuri Line was Colonel Yahara, a brilliant defensive strategist who had studied the American military system and adapted his tactics accordingly. Yahara had designed a series of mutually supporting positions that would force the Americans to attack prepared defenses in detail. The Japanese tunnel systems were engineering marvels that reflected the desperate nature of Japanese preparation. Caves were connected by underground passages, command posts were buried deep in the mountains, and supply lines were hidden from American observation. These tunnels allowed Japanese forces to move freely while remaining protected from American firepower. Southern Okinawa was characterized by a series of ridges and hills that ran generally east-west across the island. These terrain features provided excellent defensive positions and forced the Americans to attack uphill against prepared defenses. The ridge lines became the scene of some of the most bitter fighting of the entire campaign. The American advance began on April 15th, 2 weeks after the initial landing. The Auguste Corps, commanded by Major General John Hodge, would attack along the western side of the island, while the 3 amphibious corps under Major General Roy Geiger would attack from the east. Between them lay the central mountains where the Japanese main defensive positions were located. One of the first major objectives was Hill 89, which dominated the western approaches to the Shuri Line. The hill had been heavily fortified by the Japanese, who had positioned machine guns, mortars, and artillery to cover all approaches. Taking the hill would require direct assault against prepared positions. American artillery batteries opened fire on Hill 89 in preparation for the assault. But the Japanese positions were well protected and many shells fell harmlessly on the jungle canopy above. The Japanese defenders waited in their caves and bunkers, ready to meet the American attack. The American infantry attack began at dawn, with companies advancing across open ground toward the Japanese positions. But the defenders had excellent fields of fire, and the first assault was quickly stopped with heavy casualties among the attacking Americans. Marine and Army flamethrower teams, trained specifically for fighting Japanese cave positions, advanced under heavy fire to point-blank range. Their flamethrowers were directed into cave entrances and bunker openings, forcing Japanese defenders to emerge into American small arms fire. The fighting for Hill 89 was bitter in close quarters. Americans and Japanese fought hand-to-hand in the trenches and caves. The Japanese had been ordered to fight to the last man, and they honored that order. Few prisoners were taken on either side. After 3 days of fighting, the Americans finally secured Hill 89, but the cost had been enormous. Dozens of Americans were killed and wounded, and the Japanese defenders had sold their lives dearly. This pattern would be repeated on every ridge and hill in the Southern campaign. With Hill 89 secured, the Americans advanced toward the Makinado Line, the first of 3 major Japanese defensive positions. The line was named after the village of Makinado and consisted of a series of ridges and hills that had been fortified with extensive tunnel systems. The Makinado Line had been prepared over several months by Japanese engineer units. Trenches connected the various positions. Machine gun nests were positioned to cover all approaches, and artillery and mortars were sited to support the defenders. It was a textbook example of defensive preparation. American tanks attempted to support the infantry advance, but the terrain was often too rough for armored effectively. Japanese anti-tank guns positioned in caves and behind natural cover picked off American tanks at ranges where the American guns could not effectively respond. One of the most famous battles of the Shuri Line was the assault on Kakazu Ridge. This small ridge, only 100 meters long, was nevertheless strongly defended and became a symbol of the bitter fighting that characterized the entire campaign. The battle for Kakozu Ridge lasted for 2 weeks and cost hundreds of American casualties. The Japanese defended the ridge with desperate determination, launching counterattacks every night and forcing the Americans to fight for every yard of ground. The Makinado Line finally fell on April 24th after 2 weeks of bitter fighting. But this was not the end of the Japanese defenses. It was just the beginning of a series of positions that stretched across the southern part of the island. The main Shuri Line was the most heavily fortified position on Okinawa. Built around the ancient Shuri Castle, which had served as the capital of the Ryukyu Kingdom for centuries, the position was designed to be the last defensive line on the island. Shuri Castle was more than just a historical monument. It was the center of the Japanese defensive system on Okinawa. The ancient walls and moats had been incorporated into modern fortifications, and the castle grounds had been turned into a fortress. General Ishijima had established his main command post in the caves beneath Shuri Castle. From here, he could coordinate the defense of the entire southern part of the island and maintain contact with Japanese forces on other islands. The assault on Shuri Castle began in early May. American forces attacked from multiple directions using tanks, artillery, and infantry to try to break through the Japanese defenses. But the Japanese defenders were well prepared and fought fiercely for every position. Japanese forces launched frequent counterattacks against American positions, often at night when American artillery and air support were less effective. These attacks were costly for the Japanese, but succeeded in disrupting American operations and inflicting casualties. American tank losses during the assault on Shuri Castle were heavy. Japanese anti-tank guns, positioned in caves and behind natural cover, were able to engage American tanks at close range where the American guns could not effectively respond. After weeks of fighting, the Americans finally captured Shuri Castle on May 29th, but the victory came at a terrible cost. The castle had been reduced to rubble, and the surrounding area was littered with the bodies of American and Japanese soldiers. With the fall of Shuri Castle, Japanese forces were forced to withdraw to their final defensive positions in the southern part of the island. General Ushijima ordered his remaining forces to fall back to the area around the town of Mabuni, where they would make their final stand. The final Japanese defensive positions were located in the caves and ridges around Mabuni. These positions were the last stronghold of Japanese resistance on Okinawa and would be the scene of the final battles of the campaign. American forces pursued the retreating Japanese forces into the southern part of the island. But the Japanese had prepared for this eventuality as well, and their final positions were even more strongly fortified than the Shuri Line had been. The final battle of the Shuri Line campaign was fought on Mabuni Hill, where even school children had been pressed into military service. Children as young as 12 were trained to use bamboo spears and hand grenades. They were told that they would be able to help defend the island, and that fighting and dying for the emperor was the highest honor they could achieve. Women and teenage girls had also been conscripted into military roles. They were trained to use weapons and were assigned to various support roles in the Japanese military. Many were given suicide grenades and told to kill themselves rather than be captured. The indoctrination campaign was not limited to military training. Japanese teachers and officials had been telling Okinawans for months that American capture would be worse than death. Stories of American atrocities were circulated, and civilians were told that they would be tortured and humiliated if they fell into American hands. Central to the Japanese strategy was the concept of shame. In Japanese culture, being captured alive was considered a great dishonor that would disgrace not just the individual, but their family and community. This cultural attitude was exploited by Japanese military leaders who told civilians that suicide was preferable to capture. Civilians had been forced to work on fortifications throughout the island. Men, women, and children had dug trenches, built bunkers, and prepared positions for the Japanese military. This work had been presented as a patriotic duty, but it had also served to implicate civilians in the military defense of the island. When the American landing began on April 1st, many civilians were still working on fortifications or had been assigned to support roles in the Japanese military. As the battle progressed and American forces advanced, these civilians found themselves trapped between the advancing Americans and the retreating Japanese. Japanese military leaders began ordering civilians to fight alongside their soldiers. Families were given weapons and told to defend their homes and communities. In many cases, civilians were forced to take up arms simply to avoid being shot by Japanese soldiers for us showing cowardice. As American forces advanced and Japanese positions collapsed, many civilians chose to commit suicide rather than face capture. Whole families would gather in caves and use hand grenades or poison to kill themselves. This practice, known as ikirakomi or a self-destruction, became increasingly common as the battle progressed. Survivors of the mass suicides have provided heartbreaking testimony about what they witnessed. Children describe seeing their parents kill themselves and their siblings before taking their own lives. Families would hold ceremonies where each member would say their final words before committing suicide together. American soldiers and medics who encountered these scenes of mass suicide were often traumatized by what they witnessed. Some Americans tried to intervene, but the language barrier and the rapid pace of combat made it difficult to save civilians who had decided to die. The most tragic aspect of the civilian casualties was the way entire families would commit suicide together. Parents would kill their children first, then themselves. Grandparents would take their grandchildren with them to ensure they would not be left alone in a hostile world. Many civilians, especially young men, actually enlisted in the military. Everything I do is so instinctive and so passionate. When these positions were overrun by American forces, I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks. American forces eventually developed strategies to try to rescue civilians from mass suicide situations. English-speaking Okinawans were used as interpreters, and American troops were instructed to try to convince civilians to surrender. But the psychological conditions had been so effective that these efforts. The civilian casualty figures from the Battle of Okinawa are staggering. Approximately 150,000 civilians were killed during the battle, many through suicide rather than military action. This represented about half of the pre-war civilian population of the island. The children who survived the battle often found themselves orphaned and alone. Many had watched their parents and siblings commit suicide and were too traumatized to speak about their experiences. American military authorities struggled to provide care for these child survivors. The cultural factors that contributed to the mass suicide were complex and deeply rooted in Okinawan Japanese society. The concepts of honor, shame, and duty have been explained by Japanese military leaders who told civilians that death. American military psychologists and anthropologists work to understand the mass suicide phenomenon. The cultural differences make it difficult to develop effective countermeasures. The American approach of emphasizing safety and protection seems inadequate as deeply held beliefs about honor and shame. The aftermath of the mass suicide campaign left deep scars on Okinawan society. Entire families and communities had been wiped out, and the survivors were often too traumatized to speak about their experiences. The cultural trauma would affect Okinawan society for generations. Japanese military leaders bore significant responsibilities for the civilian casualties. Their indoctrination campaigns convinced many civilians that death was preferable to capture, and in fact provide adequate protection for The civilian tragedy of the Battle of Okinawa was one of the most tragic aspects of the entire Pacific War. The mass suicide campaign represented a failure of leadership and a breakdown of the protections that should have been afforded to non-combatants. It served as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of protecting civilians during military operations. While the land battle raged on Okinawa, Japan made one final desperate attempt to influence the course of the campaign. Operation Tengo, or Heavenly Operation, would send Japan's most prized warship on a one-way mission to Okinawa. The battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever built, would attempt to beach herself on the shores of Okinawa. and use her massive guns to support the Japanese defenders. The mission was conceived by Admiral Yamamoto, who believed that the Yamato could reach Okinawa and provide crucial artillery support for the defenders. Despite the ship's age and the lack of adequate air cover, Yamamoto convinced the Japanese High Command to approve the mission. The Yamato was truly a marvel of naval engineering. At 863 feet long and weighing 69,000 tons, she was larger than any American or British battleship. She carried 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted, and was protected by armor up to 16 inches thick. The crew of the Yamato was carefully selected from the Japanese Navy's most experienced sailors. Many had served aboard the ship for years. Even school children had been pressed into military service. Children as young as 12 were trained to use bamboo spears and hand grenades. They were told that they would be able to help defend the island, and that fighting and dying for the emperor was the highest honor they could achieve. Women and teenage girls had also been conscripted into military roles. They were trained to use weapons and were assigned to various support roles in the Japanese military. Many were given suicide grenades and told to kill themselves rather than be captured. The indoctrination campaign was not limited to military training. Japanese teachers and officials had been telling Okinawans for months that American capture would be worse than death. Stories of American atrocities were circulated, and civilians were told that they would be tortured and humiliated if they fell into American hands. Central to the Japanese strategy was the concept of shame. In Japanese culture, being captured alive was considered a great dishonor that would disgrace not just the individual, but their family and community. This cultural attitude was exploited by Japanese military leaders who told civilians that suicide was preferable to capture. Civilians had been forced to work on fortifications throughout the island. Men, women, and children had dug trenches, built bunkers, and prepared positions for the Japanese military. This work had been presented as a patriotic duty, but it had also served to implicate civilians in the military defense of the island. When the American landing began on April 1st, many civilians were still working on fortifications or had been assigned to support roles in the Japanese military. As the battle progressed and American forces advanced, these civilians found themselves trapped between the advancing Americans and the retreating Japanese. Japanese military leaders began ordering civilians to fight alongside their soldiers. Families were given weapons and told to defend their homes and communities. In many cases, civilians were forced to take up arms simply to avoid being shot by Japanese soldiers for us showing cowardice. As American forces advanced and Japanese positions collapsed, many civilians chose to commit suicide rather than face capture. Whole families would gather in caves and use hand grenades or poison to kill themselves. This practice, known as ikirakomi or a self-destruction, became increasingly common as the battle progressed. Survivors of the mass suicides have provided heartbreaking testimony about what they witnessed. Children describe seeing their parents kill themselves and their siblings before taking their own lives. Families would hold ceremonies where each member would say their final words before committing suicide together. American soldiers and medics who encountered these scenes of mass suicide were often traumatized by what they witnessed. Some Americans tried to intervene, but the language barrier and the rapid pace of combat made it difficult to save civilians who had decided to die. The most tragic aspect of the civilian casualties was the way entire families would commit suicide together. Parents would kill their children first, then themselves. Grandparents would take their grandchildren with them to ensure they would not be left alone in a hostile world. Many civilians, especially young men, had actually been pressed into military service and were fighting alongside Japanese soldiers. When these positions were overrun by American forces, the civilian soldiers faced the same choices as the regular military: fight to the death or commit suicide. American forces eventually developed strategies to try to rescue civilians from mass suicide situations. English-speaking Okinawans were used as interpreters, and American troops were instructed to try to convince civilians to surrender. But the psychological conditioning had been so effective that these efforts often failed. The civilian casualty figures from the Battle of Okinawa are staggering. Approximately 150,000 civilians were killed during the battle. many through suicide rather than military action. This represented about half of the pre-war civilian population of the island. The children who survived the battle often found themselves orphaned and alone. Many had watched their parents and siblings commit suicide and were too traumatized to speak about their experiences. American military authorities struggled to provide care for these child survivors. The cultural factors that contributed to the mass suicide were complex and deeply rooted in Okinawan and Japanese society. The concepts of honor, shame, and duty had been exploited by Japanese military leaders who told civilians that death was preferable to capture. American military psychologists and anthropologists worked to understand the mass suicide phenomenon, but the cultural differences made it difficult to develop effective countermeasures. The American approach of emphasizing safety and protection seemed inadequate against deeply held beliefs about honor and shame. The aftermath of the mass suicide campaign left deep scars on Okinawan society. Entire families and communities had been wiped out, and the survivors were often too traumatized to speak about their experiences. The cultural trauma would affect Okinawan society for generations. Japanese military leaders bore significant responsibility for the civilian casualties. Their indoctrination campaign had convinced many civilians that death was preferable to capture, and their failure to provide adequate protection for non-combatants had contributed to the tragedy. The civilian tragedy of the Battle of Okinawa was one of the most tragic aspects of the entire Pacific War. The mass suicide campaign represented a failure of leadership and a breakdown of the protections that should have been afforded to non-combatants. It served as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of protecting civilians during military operations. While the land battle raged on Okinawa, Japan made one final desperate attempt to influence the course of the campaign. Operation Tengo, or Heavenly Operation, would send Japan's most prized warship on a one-way mission to Okinawa. The battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever built, would attempt to beach herself on the shores of Okinawa and use her massive guns to support the Japanese defender. The mission was conceived by Admiral Yamamoto, who believed that the Yamato could reach Okinawa and provide crucial artillery support for the defenders. Despite the ship's age and the lack of adequate air cover, Yamamoto convinced the Japanese High Command to approve the mission. The Yamato was truly a marvel of naval engineering. At 863 feet long and weighing 69,000 tons, she was larger than any American or British battleship. She carried 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted, and was protected by armor up to 16 inches thick. The crew of the Yamato was carefully selected from the Japanese Navy's most experienced sailors. Many had served aboard the ship for years. Memorial services for the war dead became important events for both American and Japanese forces. These services honored not just the military dead, but also the civilians who had died in the battle. They served as reminders of the human cost of war and the importance of peace. The high casualty rate at Okinawa had a profound impact on American war planning. The projected casualties for the invasion of Japan were so high that alternative strategies were seriously considered. This would ultimately lead to the decision to use atomic bombs rather than conduct a full invasion. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, were influenced in part by the lessons learned at Okinawa. The high casualties suffered by American forces during the Pacific Campaign made the use of atomic weapons seem like a way to end the war quickly and save American lives. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, marked the official end of World War II. The atomic bombings had convinced Japanese leaders that continued resistance was futile. The formal surrender ceremony was held on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Despite the end of the war, American forces remained on Okinawa. The strategic importance of the island had been demonstrated during the battle, and the Americans planned to maintain a permanent military presence to deter future aggression. American military bases were established throughout Okinawa. These bases would serve as the foundation of American military strategy in the Pacific for the next 75 years. The bases provided forward deployment capabilities and served as symbols of American commitment to regional security. The American military presence had a profound cultural impact on Okinawan society. Traditional Okinawan culture was mixed with American influences, creating a unique hybrid society that was neither fully Japanese nor fully American. American military spending provided an economic boost to Okinawa's reconstruction. Base construction and operations employed thousands of Okinawans and helped to rebuild the island's infrastructure. But this economic dependence on the American military created its own set of challenges. Greed. The American military presence also created political tensions. Some Okinawans welcomed the security provided by the American bases, while others resented the foreign military occupation of their island. These tensions would persist for decades. In 1972, Okinawa was formally returned to Japanese administration, but the American military presence continued, with over 70% of American military bases in Japan located on Okinawa. This arrangement continued to be a source of political tension and cultural conflict. Memorial parks were established throughout Okinawa to honor the war dead. These parks served as places of reflection and remembrance for both Japanese and American visitors. They provided a way for survivors and descendants to honor those who had died in the battle. Survivor testimonies have provided important insights into the civilian experience of the Battle of Okinawa. These accounts have helped historians understand the psychological and cultural factors that contributed to the tragedy and have provided context for the military history. Educational programs were established to teach Okinawan children about the history of the battle. These programs emphasized the importance of peace and the costs of war. They served as a way to ensure that the lessons of the battle would not be forgotten. Efforts were made to preserve Okinawan culture and history. Traditional crafts, music, and language were preserved and promoted as part of the island's cultural identity. This preservation efforts helped to maintain Okinawan distinctiveness within the larger Japanese context. Today, the legacy of the Battle of Okinawa continues to influence Okinawan society and politics. The presence of American military bases remains a contentious issue, and the memory of the battle continues to shape the island's relationship with both Japan and the United States. Reconciliation efforts between the United States and Japan have helped to heal the wounds of war. Military cooperation between the two nations has become a cornerstone of regional security in the Pacific, but the memory of the battle continues to serve as a reminder of the costs of conflict. The Battle of Okinawa ultimately served as a catalyst for peace in the Pacific. The terrible costs of the battle convinced both sides that further war was unthinkable. The subsequent alliance between the United States and Japan became a model for reconciliation and cooperation. The Battle of Okinawa was both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of World War II in the Pacific, but it was also the beginning of a new era of peace and cooperation. The memory of the battle serves as a reminder of the costs of war and the importance of working to prevent future conflicts. Epilogue. Lessons of Okinawa. As we reflect on the Battle of Okinawa, we are reminded that history is not just about dates and statistics, but about the human stories that lie behind the grand narrative of war. The 82 days of fighting on this small island in the Pacific witnessed both the worst and best of humanity. In the decades since the battle, survivors from both sides have come together to honor the memory of those who died and to work for peace. Their meetings have shown that even the deepest wounds of war can be healed through understanding and forgiveness. The Peace Memorial Park in Mabuni stands as a testament to the desire for peace and the determination to prevent future conflicts. Its simple design and beautiful setting provide a place for reflection and remembrance. Modern Okinawa is a thriving community that has rebuilt itself from the ashes of war. Its people have shown remarkable resilience and determination to create a peaceful and prosperous future for themselves and their children. The alliance between the United States and Japan, built on the foundation of the sacrifices made at Okinawa, has become a model for international cooperation and regional security. It stands as a testament to the possibility of reconciliation after conflict. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Battle of Okinawa is that peace is not something that can be taken for granted. It must be worked for, nurtured, and protected. The children who play in the parks of modern Okinawa represent the future that was made possible by the sacrifices of those who fought and died in 1945. Each year, memorial ceremonies are held to honor the dead of the Battle of Okinawa. These ceremonies bring together survivors, families, and descendants to remember and reflect. They serve as reminders of the costs of war and the importance of peace. The reconciliation between the United States and Japan stands as one of the great achievements of the post-war period. It shows that even the most bitter enemies can become partners in peace when they choose to focus on the future rather than the past. The future of Okinawa lies in the hands of its people. They have shown that they can rebuild from devastation and create a peaceful society. Their example serves as an inspiration to people around the world who seek to overcome the legacy of conflict and build a better future. The Battle of Okinawa ended in 1945, but its lessons continue to guide us today. The terrible costs of war, the importance of protecting civilians, and the possibility of reconciliation after conflict all find their echo in the events of this small Pacific island. May we never forget these lessons, and may we always work for peace. This has been the story of the Battle of Okinawa, 82 days that changed the world. In the end, it was not just a battle between armies, but a test of human will, courage, and the capacity for both destruction and reconciliation. The island that became a battlefield is now a symbol of peace, and those who died there are remembered not as enemies, but as human beings who suffered and died in the ultimate test of war. May their sacrifice never be forgotten, and may their legacy inspire us to build a world where such sacrifices are never necessary again.